Hello and welcome to Altura Tech Consulting series of videos on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. My name is Guillermo Cardona and I'm a senior architect with Altura Tech Consulting. Today we're going to be doing a video on how to use Power Automate to calculate totals on subgrade records. The requirement that we have is we have a parent entity that has a subgrid, kind of like the sales order entity with order products, same way of thinking. And how do we go ahead and calculate the totals of those subgrids if there's an amount field in it, and then post it into the parent record? The requirement is that the total has to be calculated when the record is created, updated, or deleted. We want to use low code or no code at all, and we need to run this as close to real time as possible. For considerations, of course, for those of us that have been doing Dynamics for a while, we know we can use roll-up fields to do this. However, there are certain limitations in roll-up fields, like for example, the fact that they only get calculated on certain times, and of course that would take away the requirement of it being as close to real time as possible. Now there are workarounds around that. There's a workflow toolbox out there that would allow you to run a regular workflow and trigger that roll-up calculation a lot quicker. But then again, you're using the older platform instead of the new Power Automate. So we want to show you how to do this with Power Automate. And again, there's certain limitations with using roll-up fields, etc. Plugins or JScripting, again, that would be an issue because that would require code, and we want to basically keep it to low code or no code. We could use Power Automate by itself using the Common Data Service connector, the new one, with the current environment. Problem is that there is an issue with the delete trigger. So whenever you delete a record using in Dynamics, the Common Data Service trigger or a close trigger, but then the output only has the GUID of that record that was deleted. It doesn't contain anything else from that record. So if I actually needed the ID of the record, the parent record, I can't get it. Or if I need anything else from that actual child record, it's no longer there. So that, of course, poses a problem. So I had to come up with a way to do this using a hybrid model of Power Automate and an actual Dynamics 365 workflow. So how do I come up with the solution? Basically, 4 different workflows, 3 workflows in Power Automate, and then 1 Dynamics 365 workflow. So in Power Automate, I have a child flow that basically does the actual calculation. It takes a look at all the items in that subgrid. It puts them in an array. It does a for each statement, and then it calculates whatever the subtotal is. Then there's another one, another flow that basically triggers on the creation of a subgrid item or on the update and triggers a child workflow. So we take care of that scenario. And then there's another one that will trigger an update of a field that gets updated by the actual Dynamics 365 workflow. Now what's going to happen is that actual Dynamics 365 workflow will trigger on the delete event of a record, of that subgrid record. The cool thing about the legacy workflows is that when you trigger something on the delete, it actually keeps track of everything on that record. So I have access to the actual parent record. I have access to any amount if I needed it, anything like that. So I can then trigger or basically update a field on the parent record saying, hey, go ahead and make sure you do the calculation, and then trigger that workflow that I created earlier to do the calculation using the child workflow. So let's go ahead and see how this is done. So here I am in Power Automate to create the flow. Now, a few things in mind in case that you didn't know. There are 2 different Common Data Service connectors that we're going to be using, that you can use. There's the regular one, the older one, and then the new one. The new one, current environment, is the one that you should be using if you're dealing with dynamics, that's best practice. The only way how you can actually use this is if you start from a solution. So you have to create an actual solution for that Dynamics 365 environment. And then from that solution, basically go to new and flow, and then that will be able to then not only add that flow to that solution, but then also show up the actual new common data service current environment connector. Now, there are a lot of really good reasons on how to use this. There's different blogs out there that will tell you that. I'm not going to get into that right now, but basically this is what you should be doing. But anyway, so we're going to be creating first the child workflow that's going to be basically doing all the calculations. So to do that, I'm going to create a child workflow that's going to be triggered manually. And for that, I'm going to need an actual input. So I'm going to call it the service completed ID. Our parent entity is called services completed. So we're going to do that. The next, after that, after I get that service completed, then I'm going to do some sort of action. But before I do that, I'm going to, can't spell. I'm going to initialize a couple variables. I'm actually tracking two different totals. I'm tracking an annual total and a regular total. So I'm going to initialize those variables. They're both going to be floats. I'm going to initialize both variables at the same time. They shouldn't put a lot of strain into the system if we do it at the same time. Plus, it keeps things organized. And let's do, this is medical. Okay. And again, we're going to do float. One really important tip is to actually label your steps. It makes things a lot better, especially for troubleshooting. And let's label this one here. Okay. Now the next step is, now that I have the ID that it's given to me by another flow, and it's sent to this flow via this step, and now I'm going to get all the records that are in that subgrid that have that ID on that field. So I'm going to use the current environment, current data service connector, and I'm going to list records. That's the one that basically where you can get all of them. So, and I'm going to, in this case, get the medical costs, which is the ones that I want. And after that, I'm going to expand here to do the select query and the filter. In this case, I'm going to put a filter based on that field. Now, one interesting thing about this filter query, whenever you're using that parent ID, one thing I found out very quickly was that you can't just type in the name of that field. You actually have to do it like this. A really nice way to figure out what that is by using the XRM toolbox, and you can actually find out. You can create a fetch XML query. It will tell you what it is, and then put it in here. So now I'm going to say this is equal to, and service complete ID. Make sure you always put a single quote in the beginning and in the end. And then I'm going to do an, let me make sure that this has an actual title. Okay. Then after that, since I know this is going to be an array, I'm going to do a control and apply to each, although that should typically come up depending on what I'm trying to do, but I'm, for this exercise, I'm just going to do that and say for each. Now, here's one thing that you also have to remember. Now, this is going to come up and get everything. Now, what if I'm actually deleting the last record in that subgrid? Well, if that happens, this here may end up, whatever happens after this may end up failing because I don't have any step in here to contemplate for that possibility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another action in between these. And I'm going to say, let me take a look at the length of this array, basically meaning if there's any values on that array, then I'm going to go ahead and do my calculation. If there's no values, that means I've deleted all of them, so I'm just going to set that to 0. So let me go ahead and make a note of it. So this is for O. Are there any medical costs? And the way how you calculate if there's an item in that array is by doing a length of the values of that array. So then I added the length on the dynamic, then I go to dynamic context, and then I select the value of the array that I calculated here, medical cost, and click OK. And then after that, I can say if this is greater than 0, then that means there's actually items in this array calculated here, or that there are records in here. Okay. So if there are values, then I'm going to then drag this apply to each into the yes selection. So meaning that if there's a yes, then for every item, now I'm going to bring in the total of the annual field and the total field and increment each corresponding variable with those items. So I'm going to then go ahead and do variable. And system is a bit slow this morning. Let's try this again. There we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and do an increment variable. And what this will do is that it will take whatever item that I have, let's say in the case of the medical cost total, and whatever item that I have on the array, and I'm going to add it to this variable. And and this is going to go down a loop. So if I have 15 times or 15 records, it's going to keep adding that value to that variable. So pretty neat way of doing this. I'm just going to select the total cost field and add it to that. And I'm going to do the same thing for the annual cost and do that. Cost. Again, making sure that I do the actual labeling. Increment medical total cost. And over here, we're going to cost. Okay. And then once I'm done with that, I'm then going to update that parent record. Always use the one that's its current environment. Update the record. And then I'm going to go back to services completed. And the item ID is going to be the one that I captured in the beginning. And then after that, I'm going to put in what the total is. Let's see, it's down here. So projected annual cost, that, and then projected total cost is that. Now, one thing, remember that there is a step when a record gets deleted. Remember I mentioned that what's going to happen is that I'm going to update a field so that update triggers then the flow that will then trigger this child workflow. So that field is called the calculate medical cost field, which is right here. It's just a Boolean. And the workflow that's going to be triggered on the delete event is going to set that to yes. Well, I don't want this to keep, to not trigger all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to no to make sure that that doesn't get done all the time. So we'll show you how this is set to yes later, and then the flow that runs on the update is going to run based on this field only when this is equal to yes. So if somebody goes ahead and sets it to no, then that doesn't do anything. Now it's, of course, it may be an unnecessary step. It just keeps things a little bit cleaner, especially when you're looking for troubleshooting and or testing purposes. Granted, you can only trigger only on the update, and if you're only updated, it doesn't really matter what the value is, but I think this keeps it a little bit cleaner. Okay, so we're going to do that. Now, what if there are no more records? Well, if there's no more records, I'm just going to go ahead and update the value of the two fields that I updated on the previous step with zeros, because that means that there's no more values in there. So I'm going to do the services completed. The item ID is going to be from the beginning. And by the way, you don't have to do an actual scroll down. You can just start typing in here, and it will show up. But I'm lazy. I just scroll. Again, we're going to set that to no. And now the projected medical cost and annual cost are going to be basically 0. Okay. Now, when I'm doing child flows, and actually, let me do a labeling real quick. Should take a couple seconds. Okay. And in here, I'm going to do 5.21. Okay. And again, check the spelling. Okay. Now, once you're done, if this was a regular manual workflow, then you're done. But since we're calling this as a child workflow, I got to return a step back to the parent record so that it knows that it completed completely. So I'm going to add one final step. So you have to actually add a step to basically let the parent record know that, or the parent flow know that everything ran fine. So I'm going to do a respond to Power App or flow. You got to do that in any time that you're including a flow in a Power App or in a parent flow. And then I'm going to do a output of status and then basically say it was successful. Now there's a couple things I can do here. I mean, if it wasn't successful, I can respond that it wasn't. There's different things that you can do. You can put in a different condition, but in this case, I'm just going to let it to be like that. Okay. So I'm going to name this child flow medical cost. Always try to use your labels to be as informative as possible. Calculate totals. Okay, gonna do that. Now I got the child flow. Now I got to create the actual flow that's going to call it whenever I'm actually creating or updating a record on that medical flow or medical cost entity. So I'm going to wait for this to save, and then I'm going to go back to my solution and then do it from there so I can use that common data service connector. So one thing I have noticed that every now and then I get this message thinking where the browser thinks that there's things done here. Not sure why that happens, but I just ignore it, make sure that everything works fine. So So I'm going to go to the actual solution, and I'm going to go ahead and create a flow from here. Okay. Now the flow, I'm going to start by, this is the one that basically gets triggered when a record gets created or updated on that subgrid. So I'm going to start with a common data service. The trigger is going to be a create or update. Again, remember that you could do a delete as well, but that is not going to work. And basically the whole thing is going to fail because I won't be able to move on since I won't have any more data. So create or update. The entity name is going to be the medical cost entity. And as far as scope, I'm going to do organization just so I don't have to worry about any security or anything like that. And then I'm not going to filter anything. Basically, I'm going to do it whenever any field is updated. I'm not going to put any filter on that. I'm not going to put any filtering on a specific attribute either. So I'm just going to do it like that. Okay. So I'm going to rename this real quick. A medical. Okay. Now the next step is extremely easy. All I'm going to do is run a child flow, and the list of flows are going to be here. So I created the medical cost calculate totals. It's right there. And then my input is going to be the parent record. So you could probably see why this is important. You're going to need that parent record to then tell the system, hey, take a look at the remaining records in there and then do the calculation. If I do a delete statement and I don't have the parent, I can't do that. So that's why you need to do what we're doing. So this is medical cost. When record created or updated, calculate totals. Okay, say that. And then finally, once this is done, we're going to go ahead and create the workflow that is going to be triggered on the update event. So let me go ahead and create another one, create flow. And this time again, common data service. And we're going to be looking at the parent record this time. Let's see, come on. Anything. Oh, sorry. Oops. I was doing I was doing a search on the trigger. My bad. Anyway, it happens to the best of us, right? So service is completed. Again, scope, organization. Now this time I'm going to be filtering it only when a specific attribute gets triggered. So I'm going to take a look at the name of that attribute real quick. And I'm going to look for my entity. And here's my entity. And I'm going to look for the actual field, which is this one here. And I'm going to copy and paste. And basically what I'm telling the system is only run when this field is updated. Okay. Now I can go ahead and do an extra step and say only do it when it equals yes. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a huge deal. I mean, you can basically have that delete workflow and update it, and anytime that it updates, I mean, I could have had a text box and just update it with anything, doesn't matter, and then it would have triggered. I like this approach better because then it helps me troubleshoot on what's going on and monitor what's going on. So the delete workflow will set it to yes. This will then update it to no, and that way you know when each of them has run. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead now and do the actual child workflow and calculate medical cost, and I'm done. Let me do when calculate medical cost is set to yes and update it. Okay. This is going to be triggered out of the service completed entity. Calculate totals. Okay. And I'm going to save that. Oh, it's actually, I forgot to do that. Cool thing about the troubleshooter is that it gives you little hints of when something is missing. So another nice feature. So added the services completed ID, and now I can save this. Okay. Perfect. So now we have to then go ahead and create the actual workflow, the Dynamics 365 workflow that will trigger based on that lead event. So I'm in Dynamics 365. I went to the advanced settings in the system, got to processes and clicked on new, and it gave me the legacy workflow UI where I can go ahead and create the workflow. So a few things I'm going to set in here. Again, I'm not going to worry about security, so I'm going to set this for organization, and I'm going to check this for when the record is deleted, and I'm going to be triggering it from the medical cost entity. And all I'm going to do is do one step. I'm just going to do an update step. I need to move this down a little bit, and I'm going to do an update record. And I'm not going to update the medical cost, of course, because that record is going to be deleted. I'm going to update the parent. See, this is something that I cannot do in Power Automate as it is right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to find the field that is the calculate medical cost, and I'm going to set it to yes. And that's all I'm going to be doing. Okay. I'm going to save and close. And that's it. Activate this record, activate, and we're good to go. So now if I actually go into the application and I go to a service that I've done, I can go ahead and go to the system itself and then do any type of calculations that I want. So let's take a look at how you would do that in Dynamics. So I actually have an entity here where I would basically add the medical costs. This is my parent record. The service is completed, and then I got medical costs in here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new one. And I'm just going to say, wrong code. I'm going to add one of these codes that I always use. And this doesn't matter. And then I'm going to set the calculation based on the data that I have. Actually, do this. And based on that data, the system does the calculation where I have the 3260 for the annual cost, and the total cost is 3260. So once the process runs behind the scenes, everything should be fine. So if I take a look at the actual flow for the actual medical costs, and I do a refresh for all the schedules, I see that it ran over here. And then if I look on the actual history of the child workflow, I can see that it ran over here. So if I look at the totals section now, my 3260 should be updated once I refresh. So this should be 3260 and this should be 3260. So let's refresh, and I click on totals, and there it is. And again, the same thing would apply if I go ahead and update the record, or if I delete it. So if I deleted, which is the one that was causing me problems in the beginning when I was just using flow by itself, then that would be a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And again, that's going to trigger the delete workflow from Dynamics 365, and it's going to update that field to yes. So if I refresh the information and I go to totals, now I went ahead and updated to yes. So that triggers the child workflow in the background. So if I go ahead and refresh this, I should get another succeeded, and there it is. So if I go to my main record, now those two should be 0. I go to totals, now that's 0. So that actually seems like it worked fine. So that gives you an idea on how you can use a combination of Power Automate and Dynamics 365 workflows to accomplish your needs. Again, all using low code and no code. I want to thank you very much. I hope that you enjoyed this video. We're going to be doing videos on a regular basis. If you want to get more information about this or other features of Dynamics, please reach out to us, our website, alturatechconsulting.com, or you can reach us on the information on the screen. Thank you very much and hope that you enjoy this.